So, hi everyone. Good afternoon for those who are watching us live. We are super happy to be able to have today this conversation with Monika Bickert talking about the 20 years of Facebook and the challenges of content moderation. I'm Carlos Affonso, director of ITS. Together with me, have João Archegas, a senior researcher at ITS, and we're going to have a conversation in the roughly the next 60 minutes, trying to cover some of the important challenges and lessons that we take out from this 20 years at Facebook. I would just begin very briefly talking a bit about your bio, so to get everyone at this page. So Monika is a vice president of content moderation of content policy at Meta. Monika, if I'm not mistaken, company for a while now.
I'm a dinosaur.
At the same time, it's fascinating to be a long time in a company that is well intertwined with the history of the internet to begin with. And let me just say, on behalf of ITS, how happy we are to have you here and to have this opportunity to have this conversation about important topics, content moderation.
Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure. Again, ITS of the opportunity to get down to Brazil. So this is not a hardship. It's a really nice invitation and a great chance.
All right then. So Jota, what do you say? We start with some giving Monika some space to give out some bigger more thoughts on content moderation and challenges for this 20 years.
Yeah, sure. I say maybe you can talk a little bit about your job, what you do at Meta, and the challenges you have faced in these 12 years in the company.
Happy to. And let me say the job has changed around me. I've been at Meta and I've been in this position well over 10 years. But when I started, this job was essentially setting for what people post on Facebook and what people could advertise. Had a handful of people writing those rules, a couple hundred people. And what it meant to enforce those rules. He allowed people to report to us when something violated the. They would look at it and apply the policy. That was it. Now, fast forward, and we have many different products, everything from WhatsApp to generative AI tools. We're thinking about content policy, not just in terms of what people can post, but also what should we recommend? What should people be able to monetize? The regulatory landscape has developed. When I started in this job, there really wasn't any regulatory landscape. We had a couple laws around the world that protected intermediaries for content liability, saying if you're not the speaker, then you're not liable for what is posted. Now there is an emerging labyrinth of regulations and rules that apply to social media companies. My team, that was just a handful of people, actually after I joined, some of those people quit, so it was a really small handful of people. Now it's a team that has expertise in all different areas. Have many lawyers with backgrounds in civil rights or freedom of expression or safety issues. We have people who are academics who've studied extremist organizations or who have worked in the field of child safety, either as educators. We have a former rape crisis counselor We have all sorts of people that bring different expertise to our team and also bring with them relationships with groups around the world and experts around the world to help inform policies. And we also work much more closely with engineers because one of the biggest changes in this landscape is instead of just having a person report content to us and then we will look at it, now the expectation for all of the big social media companies really is that they will be good at looking for and detecting content that breaches their terms and removing it. To do that, you have to build complicated technical. I can't build those, so I work very closely, my team works very closely with the engineers. So it's a vastly different job than when I started. We went from having a couple hundred content moderators to now having thousands of people who review content in languages around the world 24 hours a day. But we also have now technical tools. Everybody likes to talk about AI. So yes, some of them are AI-based technical tools. Some of them are not. There are other types of technical tools that we use to find and address content that violates our terms.
Can I go in a slightly different direction and ask you about something that I find especially fascinating about content policy at Meta, which is the Oversight Board? I mean, the last time we met, the Oversight Board was just an idea that was quickly being implemented, yes, but an idea. And now the Oversight Board has been up and running for maybe over 3 years now. And it has published, as of December of last year, yes, some 74, 75 decisions. In 66 of those decisions, the board actually overturned Meta's original content moderation decision, which is a very significant number. And it has also published over 240 policy recommendations to the company, of which I guess the company has committed to implementing fully or partially, maybe some 163 of those, I guess. And, you know, when you look at, the reason I'm mentioning those numbers is when you look at those specific numbers, you can come to two different conclusions. The first one is that the board is truly and fully independent, which is a great sign, especially considering all the criticism it received in the earliest days. But also, you know, the thing that I find most interesting about this is that Meta is committed to implementing even the aspects of the board's decisions that is not binding at all, which is also a very good sign. I want to ask you about, you know, how has it been to interact with the board throughout the years, last 3 years, and how do you envision Meta's relationship with the board evolving, moving forward? And, you know, another thing that is in the back of my mind is, do you still believe that this, you know, governance solution can be applied in other companies of the industry as well? Or is the board poised to be just an exception, a very welcomed exception, but still an exception?
Well, let me address first what it's been like to work with the board. It's been fascinating and rewarding, and I'm very proud that this company built and launched this board, because this is one of the reasons why it's an exception. We're the only company to have a board like this. It takes a lot of resources. It's enormously expensive. It also puts us potentially in the media crosshairs on difficult issues. And there are a lot of reasons to not launch a board like this. So why did we do it? We did it because we thought when I'd speak in rooms like this before, sometimes people would say, well, why do you get to make all this decisions? And my answer was, look, I'd love to not be making all these decisions, but there isn't really any regulation out there that makes these decisions. And even if there is regulation, and we should talk about this later, it's not going to get to the point of making decisions for social media platforms where people are posting content real time. It's just not going to work that way. So we figured we've got to do something that shows that actually we welcome other voices, and we want those voices to be informed and we want them to be representative of our global community insofar as you can actually make that a reality. And we want them to be independent. The board is, I think, as independent as you can make something that you are actually funding. So Meta funds the board, but we set up a trust. And then, we selected the co-chairs, but then from there, the board, they really are deciding which cases they're going to take. As you point out, when they issue a decision, sometimes they overrule us, and we are bound by what they decide about the particular piece of content they are reviewing. And then they can also give us recommendations that are non-binding. I'll tell you personally what I've learned from this. When we started the board, I thought it would be interesting to be able to refer particularly thorny or controversial topics to them. And that's been helpful, but that hasn't been my big learning. The big learning is they represent, in many ways, the average person's experience using our services in a way that is very hard for us to otherwise really get. We go around the world talking to people who use our services. We talk to civil society groups, we talk to advocacy groups, we talk to community groups, but it's hard to distill that and say, what is the average person's experience? The board tries to do just that. And one way that you see that is in their recommendations. They focus a lot on what it feels to be a regular person, what that interaction feels like. So they ask questions like, well, did a machine or a person review this person's report? Well, why didn't you tell them what they did wrong? You told them that it was hate speech, but you didn't say what. You said they used a slur, but you didn't tell them that slur was. So they really dive into that aspect of it, which I think is wonderful. Interestingly, you pointed out that they've overturned Meta's decisions. If you look at when they overturn our decisions, in the majority of cases, they don't disagree with the policy line. They are instead highlighting an enforcement error. So an example, I believe this was from Brazil. This was one of the first examples. I'm reaching back into my memory pretty far, though. There was an image of a woman, I think it might have been a breast exam. Breast cancer awareness. And that doesn't violate our policies. It should have been left up. We made a review mistake, enforcement error, and the board highlighted it. And when they first said, well, we're going to overturn this, I said to my team, that doesn't make any sense. There's no issue in dispute. And we should tell them that that's not a good use of their time. They said, well, thanks for your opinion. We're going to go ahead and publish this. And they were right, because what they're highlighting is important, which is that we didn't review the content correctly. So although a lot of the times that they're overturning our decisions, they don't disagree with the policy, it's still very educational. You mentioned that we tried to implement their recommendations. Some of their recommendations that I have loved are around transparency. One of the topics was around COVID and misinformation. And we had been struggling with misinformation. Is a tricky policy. It's tricky because with something like hate speech, you can write a rule. Any one of us can write a rule and say, here's exactly how I'm going to apply a hate speech policy. Now, maybe nobody's going to agree with your rule, but you can at least be really clear about where the lines are. You can't do that with a misinformation policy. You know, the world, there's just countless facts in the world and lies in the world. And I don't know, nobody at Meta can know whether, something that happens tomorrow in Brazil, we won't magically know whether a report on that is true or false. And there's not a good way to give people notice. If you say that this team won this football game, it is a falsehood. We can't put that out there for misinformation. And so with COVID, we struggled with that. We wanted to make sure that people knew that we were removing content that health authorities told us was false and could contribute to an imminent risk of people either contracting COVID or spreading COVID. But we weren't really telling people what we considered to be false. The board said, no, you have to. And so we published basically a list. Here's the stuff that we consider to be false based on what health authorities are telling us. these things may change, and we have evolved that public list, but they pushed us to publish that, and that's something I really appreciate.
And Monika, if I can jump in, especially because you were addressing issues concerning COVID, and I believe everyone felt that pretty much during those tough times out of the pandemic, that content moderation ended up being on the spotlight, because much of the conversation about COVID and prevention and vaccination ended up taking a stage online, and of course social media end up being right on the spot. And when we think about like one of the key challenges for content moderation, I'm pretty sure elections is something always that comes to our mind. But to go through a pandemic, I think that was something that we were not expecting to go through, and that ended up impacting a lot how we end up discussing what is content moderation, what are the tools available, how do people understand what content moderation is. I would love to hear your thoughts, like what are the lessons that we could take out of this very tough times that we all been through during the pandemic, and especially looking through the lenses of content moderation and policy through the platform. I think that will be amazing to hear from you.
There are many learnings, I think, across the industry and academia about content moderation from the pandemic, and largely in the area of what to do with misinformation. When I started in this job, like I said, I am a dinosaur. When I started in this job, misinformation was not really a focus. People were concerned about what we were doing about images of child exploitation. In early 2017, we started piloting an approach for dealing with misinformation, and we were the first company to do this. And so this was a lot of talking to external groups and trying to figure out what a reasonable approach might be. Underscoring that we cannot actually perfectly know the truth. We can't be the arbiter of the truth. And we don't think that one company should have the power to say this is true and this is false. We based our approach on external fact checkers. It sounds great in theory. It's quite difficult. What should your standards be for fact checkers? What's your payment relationship with fact checkers? How do you direct them to the content that is the most important to fact check, both in a technical sense, and then what sort of guidance do you give them? And then when they fact check something, what do you do with that? Do you remove it? Do you label it? Is the label really big that you have to click through, or is it kind of small and non-judgmental? And if you look at the early days of our program before the pandemic, we tested a lot of different things. So our fact-checking program began with us saying, if a fact checker rates something false, we will say disputed, and we will link to their article. Then we tested, okay, let's make this a little bit more dramatic. We will put on it, fact checked. I think we put false, and people had to click through the content to see it. And so these were the sorts of things we were testing, giving you the history here, because when it gets to the pandemic, things change. We had in probably late 2017, early 2018, we had instances where safety groups said to us, a fact check is not enough where there's an imminent risk of physical harm. And we thought, yeah, that makes sense, but how are we going to determine that something is false? And so we created a new prong to our policy. So before it was, we will fact check misinformation, we will label it with these external partners. Then we said, well, sometimes there's such a risk, physical safety, it's imminent, that we're going to work with safety partners. And if they tell us it's false and it's going to contribute to a significant risk of physical harm, imminent physical harm, we'll remove it. So now you have like small subset, we'll remove it. Bigger subset, we will fact check it. Then the pandemic comes along. So right away we had to ask ourselves, what bucket does this fit into? And we ended up determining, we had a little bit of a pre-event here, which was a measles outbreak in Samoa, where we had to make the same determination. We ended up determining that when there's a health risk, if it's an imminent health risk, it should be treated like an imminent risk of physical harm, just like a riot or something. And so we said, okay, if health authorities, who will be the safety experts here, if they tell us that it's false and it will contribute to a risk of harm. In the early days, that was stuff like, if you're a woman, you can't get COVID. If you're pregnant, you can't get COVID. That kind of thing, we would say, okay, we're actually going to remove that because that might cause people to behave in a careless manner. But if somebody said something that was, they were speculating about something that was non-health related about COVID, the origins of COVID or how it was spreading, that sort of thing, we would say, okay, but when I say how it was spreading, sorry, the origins of COVID or how people were reacting to COVID, where there's not a safety link to it, there we would use our fact-checking program. But then we thought, okay, let's actually try something else, which is informative labels. Our technology at the time was really being tested with information about COVID at such a high volume. If somebody was posting about masks, our technology could not effectively say, well, this is misinformation about masks and this is accurate about masks. But it could say, this is a post about masks. And so we said, all right, well, for all the content that is about COVID, we will put a label on it directing people to authoritative information. So it might be that somebody is sharing something totally accurate and truthful, or they're sharing an opinion or something. But either way, we would say, okay, it's not fact checkable, doesn't matter. We're going to just direct people to sites where they can get information from health authorities. If you look at how that inverse pyramid functioned during the pandemic, it played out where there were hundreds of thousands of pieces of content that we removed, and then sort of copies of that content as well. There was a much greater volume of content that was fact-checked. And then, there was millions and millions of pieces of content that got these informative labels. So that was a very interesting learning for us, that you could have these three tiers. And we've used that in elections as well. So with elections, we've said, if there is an imminent risk that somebody will not be able to vote. For instance, there's a post, the election's on Tuesday and at 10 a.m. and I post something saying, good news, everybody, they've delayed the election and the election will now be at Wednesday at noon. We can work with electoral authorities in advance and they can say, here are all the facts about the election. And that way we can actually share with our content review teams. If we see stuff that is misrepresenting this, we can remove it. Okay, so that's your bottom bucket. And then we can have our fact checkers that can help us deal with content that's not necessarily going to lead somebody to lose their vote, but nevertheless, people should have additional insight into. And then we can use informative labels in some cases to say, hey, are you interested in voting? Here's how you can learn more. There's a final kind of learning to this, though, which is the informative labels. Sometimes people get sick of those. And we saw that with they were very successful with COVID. We saw millions of visits to health sites that were driven by those informative labels. But at the same time, we have heard feedback from people that they don't want to see quite so many informative labels. So it's been a learning for us that we've had to kind of adjust what's the right level of information to provide.
And just very, very quickly, that's super interesting because it shows how there is this balance between being informative to the user, but at the same time understanding that content moderation has a degree of design and how it affects the user experience in the platform. Because on the other side of the screen, you cannot tell if the person is already informed and already visits all the due official websites and so on, and if not. So that's I think one of the biggest questions is that what do you do in terms of tagging a specific content? Do you keep tagging all the contents? How do you select which content will be tagged or not? So I think that's super interesting, especially because when we think about the pandemic, we get this period of time in which content end up being labeled. But when it comes to elections, you have this fixed period of time in which you know that elections are going to be taking place in this specific country. And just to conclude, and that's a story from the last election. I was about to vote, and I heard someone saying on the line, people were queuing to vote, and then someone on my back said, like, I want this election to to get over because I want my social network back. I want to be able to use Facebook as I used to before the elections. So that was really interesting because there was someone who was getting angry by the fact that the Facebook feed was getting a lot of content on politics and elections, and at the same time, the company reacting with pointing out to official websites and so on. So I take for your comments that there is a lot of understanding on user experience and how the user end up interacting with the platform on how you handle content moderation as well.
Definitely, and that will never stop. That will be evolving. And outside of just the misinformation context, the type of content that people see, that's also been a journey for us. In 2018, I believe it was, we announced that we were going to connect people with more content from family and friends rather than news or political content. And sometimes people think that news and political content is a lot of what you see on Facebook and Instagram. It's actually not. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think 4%, 5%, something like that. It's a much smaller percentage of content than people think. But part of that is because starting in 2018, we realized if you're thinking long-term as a company, you want to be a place where people look forward to going, and people look forward to engaging with their family and their friends. If they want news content, if they want political content, they can look for that and they can find that. But that is not going to be the focus of what we connect people with.
I think it really goes back to a very important question, which is how do you prepare for an emergency? I'm a constitutional scholar, so when you look at national constitutions, you have something called state of emergency, as you know. It has a predefined list of circumstances where, when the national government can exercise emergency powers to deal with emerging harmful, things that are unitary, whatever. And the pandemic, of course, is part of it. And, for some time, that piece of the equation, I feel like it was kind of missing from the way Facebook moderated content. Recently, the Oversight Board, and this goes back to the Trump's case in 2021, the Oversight Board made a number of recommendations to Meta. Meta responded by developing this crisis policy, which I believe was published in 2022, I guess. Yeah, and that's a very important step to me, at least as a constitutional scholar, to bring more stability and transparency to how the company is preparing for such emergencies. And I know stability and emergency often don't go together as well as one might expect. It's necessary, I think the users kind of need to tell them if this happens in the future, pandemic strikes again, or elections the results being contested in a specific country, and you have risk of violence. What are you going to do? How are you preparing for those events? If that happens, are you going to moderate content in this or that way? And connecting with this discussion about we're seeing a staggering rise in Gen AI. So right now you can create 4 realistic videos with a very short prompt, 2 or 3 sentences, and you have a false one, but a realistic video that can definitely be used for political purposes. So I want to ask you, how in your day-to-day work, how do you prepare for those situations, and how are you preparing specifically for Gen AI applications and deepfakes in the context of?
Great, and let me start by talking about crisis preparedness generally. We did publish the crisis response protocol in response to the Oversight Board asking us to do so. But largely what that did was it pushed us to be transparent about a protocol that we were already using internally. For many years, we have had a process for looking at situations where there may be an emergency. So for instance, we would be looking at what countries are having elections, where are there days that are anniversaries of events that might trigger protests, that sort of thing where we're tracking and we're making sure that we're ready to deal with it. When we have, and this is now, you can read this in the public crisis response protocol, but as I said, we've had this for some time. When there is a crisis, we have a team that is what I would call cross-functional. We have people from policy, people from legal, people from our engineering team, people from our communications team who can convey what we're doing externally, people from our public policy team who can talk to governments. We have sort of all of those people come together and figure out what our response will be. Often that involves doing things, if in the case of something that is somewhat predictable, like an election, we will come together and figure out in advance, okay, we need to have civil society on the ground telling us about the trends they are seeing and raising concern to us. Okay, we have to make sure that we have additional language reviewers who can handle a spike in some of these regional languages, because if something happens, we're going to see that spike, we need to be ready for it, let's hire those people now. So there's a lot of proactive planning that goes into that. And then when the crisis happens, depending on the level of the crisis, there is sometimes a 24-hour cross-functional people addressing that. So for instance, with Russia and Ukraine, with Israel and Gaza, we've had teams that are, when I wake up in the morning, I can look and see, okay, who's online from these different teams right now that is working in this sort of crisis management capacity. What are the developments? What are we discussing? And it's a team that's just focused on this crisis. It's really helped to add to that our human rights team, which we built in 2019, I believe. But these are human rights experts who are part of all of that. And so they're able to guide us as well in thinking about our actions through a human rights lens.
And Monika, if I may jump in the conversation about developing security protocols. Of course, Brazil has been, went through some sort of traumatic process through our all the commotion and the storming of public buildings in Brasilia in January 8th last year. And I think that ended up creating our own January 6th, our own invasion of the Capitol building image for a lot of people in Brazil, and saying that's the ugly side of political polarization, as we're seeing not only in Brazil, but like in many countries of the world. And there was this almost automatic connection with the question about how those people end up getting together, how this was all planned, how this worked out, and especially during the invasion of the public buildings, people making lives and publishing content on the internet. So that ended up having digital platforms, such to say, being connected to the conversation about what happened in January the 8th in Brazil. And that ended up scaling to a whole discussion about regulation of digital platforms in order to make sure that something like that will never happen again. And we can all agree that there is a very important discussion on saying that, first of all, this should not happen in the first place. But second, to really understand what were the role of platforms throughout the electoral process and how different platforms end up being used for different purposes. But we're seeing that content moderation end up taking a huge chunk of the blame for a lot of things that happen outside the screen. And I think Brazil ended up being one of those cases in which we're still going through a debate about platform regulation, digital platforms regulations. And we see when congressmen and women discuss this topic, they always come back to January the 8th and said, this happened in Brazil. It's somewhat connected to digital platforms, and we never get the specifics of that, with the exception of like certain platforms being used for that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you see, of course, not only in Brazil, but throughout the world, how do you see events that happen outside of the screen? And I understand that some companies sometimes use the wording of like in real life, which is something that I'm somewhat skeptical, because I think what happens on the other side of screen is, well, also real life. But I would love to hear your thoughts on how the discussion of platform regulation end up focusing on content moderation as being almost like the holy grail of platform regulation, that if you get this right, you will solve all the complexities of things that happen outside of the screen in real life, such to say. And you always get the feeling that it's slightly more complex than that. But of course, like you were the one having this vantage point to see how those things operate, and how do you see this debate moving forward in several countries around the world. Would love to hear your thoughts about that. So how do you see content moderation being this one topic of platform regulation that everyone want to get it right, but not sure if we have a champion for that to say that's the silver bullet?
It's a great question. I will start by saying I do believe that regulation will play a fundamental role, and probably should, in content moderation going forward. But I think there will be an evolution in how regulators think. We've already seen that to some extent. Some of the early ideas about how to regulate content were focused on things like, there's a 1 hour turnaround time for you to remove this kind of terrorist video, like very granular and very focused on specific pieces of content. And I think we've already started to see this evolution towards more systems-based approaches. I hope that a component of that will be serious conversation that moves beyond the, pointing the finger sort of a conversation. And we have a team that goes out and engages with regulators, and they have really productive conversations with regulators who want to understand, or would be, maybe they're not regulators yet, but they may be if they pass regulation. They want to understand how these issues really manifest themselves on social media. One of the areas that you mentioned early on in talking about Brazil was polarization. And that's a classic area where, depending on who you ask, some people will say, well, social media creates echo chambers, it's driving polarization. But then you can also find research saying, actually, people talk to a much broader range. They're exposed to a much broader range of view online than they are offline, which for me, that's certainly true. There's high school friends of mine that have views that are vastly different from my own. I don't hang out with them in real life offline. But I certainly see their content online. And indeed, when you look at the rates of polarization in countries around the world, polarization in countries that use social media a lot, polarization is increasing in some of those countries, and it's decreasing in some of the other ones. And so it actually appears that when you look at the evidence, it's not at all clear that that social media is a driver of polarization, and yet that's something that we sometimes sort of hear in the background. So I think there will be an evolution. I think it will come down to bringing about, through dialogue with civil society, with academia, with regulators, and with the industry, bringing about a higher level of understanding about social media's role in all of these issues.
Now, how do you see this discussion that the judicial analogy is to blame for the way regulators think about regulation now? Because we tend to use this analogy to explain, to give this high-level illustration of how content moderation works. as a stream of individual decisions, and that, you know, maybe the silver bullet for that is actually granting rights, procedural rights to the user. For example, a right to appeal a content moderation decision, a right to have a content moderation that was made by an automated tool reviewed by a human, and that sort of thing.
And even the language of due process,
Due
when you bring
process,
due
yeah.
process into algorithm due process or some of the
Yeah, or even, you know, the earlier idea of the Oversight Board being a Supreme Court for Facebook and that sort of stuff, you know. How do you see that discussion? Is that partially to blame for how regulators think about platform regulation? And if so, do we need a different approach? Do we need an approach based on a, I don't know, systems thinking approach?
It's so hard because it's such a natural, you know, people, this is an entirely new landscape and people want to think of it in terms of, I'm guilty of this too. You want to think of it in terms of a landscape, you know. I'm a lawyer, so I like to think about things in terms of due process and fact finding and, you know, judicial and executive and legislative decision making. So it's hard to, and a lot of people really interested in these topics academically are lawyers. So it's hard for us to take ourselves out of that frame. But I agree very much with you that I think there are limitations to that analogy. And one of the biggest ones is the oversimplification of the set of decisions that are being made. I mean, the decisions that are being made today are not, this is not a handful of decisions about whether or not you can post this or that. It's a lot of decisions being made about how algorithmic ranking will work and what, like I mentioned earlier, what should be recommended and what should be monetized and what should be advertised and to whom and what do we do for minors. I mean, the decision making is just a lot more complicated than that. And the fact finding, if you want to call it that, you know, when you have a trial, you have parties who have the time to interview people and they look at things at 360 degrees. You don't have that ability when you're making decisions in content moderation. So that's different. And that also probably means that the due process, if we want to borrow that term, is also probably going to be different. I still find using that term useful. In fact, I use it internally when we're talking to our engineering teams and we'll say, well, if we're going to do this or do that, we have to send a notification to the person using the product. It's due process. You know, we'll use the term because it's a term we know, but it does convey this fundamental idea that that we want to we want to respect the expectations of people for what's going to feel right for them. So you can only take the comparison so far. I think there is some harm in analogizing too closely, but some of those principles, you know, we're feeling them for a reason. We're feeling due process for a reason, because when people are using social media, they are going to want to know what the rules are. And if you remove their content, they are going to want to hear why you removed it. And that seems right to me.
And at the same time, if you think about it, people feel very closely that using social media is connected to the way in which he or she exercise their rights, especially not only free speech, but their rights in general. So that end up connecting to the legalese,
Yes.
like landscape to begin with. Monika, I would like to jump into a discussion about the metaverse and content moderation, since we are running short of time. But I wouldn't want to leave this conversation without asking you, how do you see the changes in content moderation when we think about the metaverse? Because one example that I think communicates very well the discussion about the metaverse is this example that Nick Clegg mentions a couple of times, that he says when he is in an environment of the metaverse, he tends to speak a little bit less louder as you would be speaking if you are using your phone. because some of us end up having this very bad habit. When we talk on the phone, we end up speaking a little bit louder as we are like pushing our voice to be heard by the person on the other side of the line. Makes no sense. But I really think it's interesting, this remark by Nick Clegg saying, when I'm in the metaverse, I speak in my normal tone. I don't need to push my voice because I feel like I'm in the presence of someone else as we are sharing the same space. And if that's true, the whole discussion about content moderation in the metaverse will end up be a discussion about not that much content or things that are being published, but how people end up behaving when they are connected, when they are engaging with someone in this digital space. And I understand that this is a topic that will be facing like more sooner than later with the technology end up bringing us together and creating the opportunities for this VR environments to feel very real. And I want to be super cautious here, but one thing that really concerns me especially is that I think that right now, since the metaverse is not fully deployed and we are getting towards that, we already have some cases that end up bringing content moderation or behavior moderation to the spot, because we have this alleged case of a person being harassed in a metaverse environment. And I have a concern that this case, I think it's a British case, turns out to be what the target case is for big data, which is a case that serves almost as like an origin story, that people heard something about it, they have pieces of the information, and when they think about something, they remember this case. So when they think about big data, they think about the target case. When we think about VR in the metaverse, they think, oh, there was this case about harassment, but we don't know exactly what happened. And that will end up leading the conversation about content and behavior moderation in the metaverse on getting people scared, anxious, not understanding what the metaverse like really is. So love to hear from you about like how do you see this conversation about content moderation plugging in into the conversation about the metaverse that by itself is already very much complicated, especially because people tend to call metaverse things that are not metaverse-like. But we'd love to hear from you. How do you see this conversation moving forward, and especially this change from something that you post from something that you do? Content moderation sounds like policing behavior, and how could you know that the person's going to behave like this or like that? How do you see that moving forward?
It's the distinction between content that violates and behavior that violates. That's something we've dealt with for a long time. I'll explain, but I think you're right that now that we have the metaverse and now that we have generative AI tools and AI tools as well, the proportion of issues that we deal with as a content policy team, the proportion of those issues that are behavioral related is going up. And in fact, we now have an actor and behavioral policy team. That's what they focus on. So even before we had the metaverse, and then separately, I think there's a narrative issue. I think you're right. Sometimes, especially when products are new, people don't know quite what to think about this product. Maybe they haven't used it themselves. I don't mean specifically about any virtual reality product that Meta is building, but just in general, when there are new technical products out there and people are sort of, how do I think about AI? How do I think about this? Sometimes stories they hear can have an outsized impact. So I think it is important for us to get it right on this and be very transparent in how we're thinking about it. Behaviorally, if you think about, are approach, let's make it real simple and think back to the old days where it was sort of just Facebook. You could post something that violated. You post a video and it has hate speech in it. Okay, that violates. Or you could still breach our rules even if you were posting only really nice things. And that might be because you were creating multiple accounts using a fake identity, or because you were doing things like buying or selling pages, or because you were artificially inflating the popularity of your page. So, I create an account or a page, and then I create a bunch of other accounts that all like that page, and I'm liking all the content from my multiple accounts to try to inflate the distribution of a piece of content. So we've always had behavioral challenges, but now when you think about virtual reality, you're talking about areas where somebody else's behavior, like we now have a policy about sort of like how you can approach somebody. Not something that you have to think about when you're just thinking about content. And that will be true with AI as well, because one thing that AI, one challenge we have to be mindful of with AI is things that used to take bad actors a long time, like a romance scam, where you really spend a lot of time cultivating a relationship with somebody before you try to scam them out of some money. That is something that AI can make much easier to do. And that's not content related, but it's behavioral. And so we're increasingly focusing on how we write behavioral policies and how we get that narrative out there early. We actually publish a report called our adversarial threat report. I would encourage people, if they're interested in this sort of thing, to take a look at it, because that focuses, a lot of that focus is on behavior. The content itself probably doesn't violate our policies, but it's about adversarial behavior and how we're thinking about behavior. But I think it's important to get that narrative out there.
I want to ask you a very open question in the context. I want to know from you, can you share one achievement?
Sure. I guess I should start with the challenge first. That's kind of hard. Well, one of the challenges, we were talking about this, think about this analogy with systems, and I agree it's got its limitations, but one of the challenges has been translating the types of issues we think about as lawyers. Issues like due process and fact finding and all of that, translating that into something that actually is practical for a social media company. So exactly the question that you asked before is, I think, that has been the challenge for me of this job. And I'm always continuing to learn as our products grow and as speech evolves around the world. Something I'm proud of. I am very pleased with again, you asked a lot of great questions because it goes to one of the other things you asked about. I'm very pleased with the process that we now have for anticipating and dealing with crises. COVID was actually a great example of that. We had policies in place for dealing with misinformation on COVID and all the other policy implications, hate speech due to COVID, threats due to COVID. We had all of those in place like in January. When the virus was first hitting, we had a team that was focused on it. And, I kind of loved that. I loved that we had the process in place, that we got the intelligence from outside. We were able to build a response. We had the right people in the right positions to put that together. And I've seen that more recently, whether it's Israel, Gaza, or Russia, Ukraine, or elections around the world, where, like I said, I wake up in the morning, I look and I kind of have the information I'm getting about what's going on around the world. And I love that we now have this process for bringing the right expertise to the right people so quickly.
All right, Monika, I cannot thank you enough for this very candid and super interesting conversation on content moderation and 20 years of the company. And just for those who are watching us on YouTube, so that was the 36th edition of the ITS Varanda, our gathering of interesting people for interesting conversations about topics that are relevant for this very complex intertwine of technology and society. And especially for those who are watching us online, we're making an effort to bring our verandas back to the in-face, the reality, the real life. We're bringing our verandas back to real life so that we can meet and we can be face-to-face. So I would like to end this public part of our veranda, sending out this, first of all, saying thanks for everyone who watched this conversation, and sending out an invitation to join us for the forthcoming editions of ITS Verandas. We hope to see you together with us in one of the future editions. And as we close the transmission here online, let me just ask you for a round of applause for Monika.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
And thanks a lot, Jota, for being together with us in this conversation. For those of you who have been watching us, it was great to have you with us. See you next time. Bye-bye.